The alarm wasn't supposed to go off at 2:11 a.m., but it did sharp, shrill bouncing off the marble floors like a scream swallowed too late. Harold didn't run. He never did. He moved with practiced calm down the dim east corridor flashlight, in one hand, the other still stained with graphite. Room 6, Degas. Nothing disturbed, except his notebook. It lay open on the guard station desk where he'd left it carelessly during break. 2 pages up. Both sketches nearly perfect replicas of museum pieces, but not copies. Reimagined. His. He blinked, and then saw her. A tall woman with sharp heels and sharper eyes. She stared at the notebook, then at him. "You've been reproducing our collection," she said, voice cold. "This is theft." Harold's lips parted. No words came. Because this wasn't how anyone was supposed to find out. Especially not her. Especially not like this. And by sunrise, half the museum staff would know. The man who watched the paint. Harold liked the silence of 2 a.m. Most nights he paced the marble hallways of the Winfield Gallery, hands clasped behind his back, rubber soles whispering against polished stone. The echo of his footsteps comforted him. Clean. Predictable. Like the rhythm of breathing. The museum at night was nothing like the museum by day. No chatter, no toddlers banging on glass, no over-eager docents pointing at brushstrokes like they understood the painter's hunger. At night, the paintings rested. Harold liked to believe they breathed too. He was a tall man, slightly stooped from years of standing. His uniform was always pressed even if the sleeves had faded to an uneven navy. He didn't speak much, didn't fumble with phones. His world was graphite and security cameras, and the little black sketchbook tucked inside his locker. Harold didn't consider himself an artist. He just copied things. Only, not quite. Each sketch he made during the night carried something different from the originals. The curvature of a back in a Degas became more strained. A stormy sky in a Turner swelled wider. Once he'd drawn a figure that wasn't in the painting at all, a woman he remembered from decades ago, standing beneath Van Gogh's irises with tears in her throat. That page he kept buried. He always started at midnight. After the second floor's final walkthrough, after the cameras were angled just so, and after Louis, his only friend on the staff, finished mopping and gave him a nod that meant, go ahead. Louis knew. Harold suspected that, but neither ever spoke of it. One night, Harold stood in front of a Rothko sketchpad balanced on one palm pencil in slow arcs. It wasn't the colors he loved, it was the silence, the depth. He didn't hear the soft footfall behind him. "Excuse me," came a clipped voice. He turned sharply. A woman in a slate-gray pantsuit stood behind him, arms crossed. Her museum badge hung from a lanyard. Curator level. Visitor. Not someone he recognized. "You're not allowed to sketch in here," she said, eyes narrowing. Harold blinked. It's personal." "Not for." She held up a finger, cutting him off. He quickly closed the book, but her eyes had already scanned the drawing. "That's unsettlingly accurate," she said, stepping closer. "And there are others, I assume." He hesitated. That pause, too long, too quiet, was enough. She raised her walkie. "Security. Send someone to East Gallery. Possible breach of protocol." Harold felt his gut hollow. "Mom, I've worked here 17 years. I'm not stealing anything." Her lips twisted. "Then why hide it?" He looked down at the sketchbook in his hand. He didn't have a good answer. "Because it's the only place I still feel like myself. Because these halls are the only gallery I'll ever be allowed in." He said none of it. By morning, the museum director had been informed. So had HR. The phrase reproduction of proprietary works floated through the air like smoke. No one listened to him say it was just graphite on paper, that it was just for himself, that he never sold, never scanned, never showed anyone, except maybe Louis once. Late at night, after a cup of vending machine coffee, when the old janitor looked at a sketch of a crumpled mother in a hopper frame and said, "You see more than most." Now that same sketch was sitting in a folder marked Evidence. By lunch, Harold was told to turn in his badge. "You're not terminated. Not yet," said Claire Delaney, the museum's assistant director. "But you're on leave. Indefinite." Harold nodded silent. She added, "You'll be given a chance to explain, but only after an internal review. Please don't come in tomorrow." He walked home that night without looking back. The next morning he stood on his narrow porch watching the mailman pass by without slowing. The sun hit the roof tiles like judgment. He hadn't told anyone, not even Louis. He opened his notebook. Inside were faces, dozens of them. Not just reproductions, not anymore. There was emotion layered under the pencil grain. Figures turning away, hands clenched, eyes glancing toward something just beyond the frame. He tore out the page with the woman from the irises, folded it once, slid it inside an envelope without an address. Then he put it under a pile of bills and shut the drawer. 2 days passed, then 3. He didn't hear from the museum. Didn't hear from Louis either. But on the 4th day, just as the sun was dipping, there was a knock on his door. It was Louis. "You left something behind," the janitor said, holding up Harold's security badge. "Figured you might want it." Harold tried to smile. "Thanks." "You okay?" Louis asked, voice low. Harold shrugged. "I don't know. Doesn't feel like I should be drawing anymore." Louis snorted softly. "You draw 'cause you breathe, Harold. You don't need permission for that." Harold said nothing. But when he shut the door, he didn't throw the badge away. He laid it gently beside the sketchbook and left the pencil on the page. The accusation echoes. The official hearing was scheduled for Tuesday. Harold sat stiffly in the too-bright conference room, hands folded over his knees like a child waiting for detention to be handed out. Across from him, Claire Delaney tapped at a tablet, glasses perched halfway down her nose. Next to her sat a younger man in a tight blazer, legal counsel, Harold guessed. "We're not here to shame you." "Mr. Watts," Claire began, her tone clipped but practiced. "But there are processes. Copyright, reputation, misinterpretation. The museum must protect its image." Harold nodded slowly. "I never sold anything," he said quietly. Claire exhaled. "That's not really the point. You made sketches of proprietary artwork in a locked facility after hours. It wasn't authorized. I've never shared them, never copied them in ink, not online, nowhere. They're just mine." The lawyer leaned forward. "Can you prove that?" Harold glanced at his sketchbook in the manila envelope on the table. "Can I prove silence, that I did nothing with them?" Claire's expression softened for a split second, then hardened again. A guest curator was alarmed by the quality and the secrecy. "She's alerted the board." "And they think I'm a thief?" Harold asked. "No one's used that word," Claire replied, though it hung unspoken in the air. By the next morning it had leaked. Not the story in full, but whispers. A security guard caught drawing masterworks. Something about forged copies, something about past offenses. None of it true, but that didn't matter once rumor had oxygen. Harold found his mailbox stuffed with a letter bearing no return address. He opened it cautiously. Inside was a single printed sheet. In large font, watchers aren't artists. No signature, just ink, just spite. He crumpled it slowly and dropped it into the trash. That afternoon he took a walk through a quiet neighborhood. Passing the back of the Winfield Gallery, he paused behind the brick fence that bordered the loading dock. The same dock he used to prop his thermos on while chatting with Louis before sunrise. Now it felt miles away. He heard voices. "You see the guy's drawings," one guard said through the open bay door. "Yeah," another replied. "Kinda eerie. Too good. Maybe he had help. I mean, dude's a night guard, not Da Vinci." Harold stepped back, boots scraping gravel. They didn't see him. But he didn't stay to hear the rest. That night back home, he found the sketchbook again. He flipped to the most recent page. The Rothko. Then a charcoal study of a woman's hand resting on her own shoulder, comforting herself. A rough pencil impression of a boy's silhouette, back turned, watching an empty hallway. He paused there. That one wasn't from any painting. That was his boy. 15 years earlier, he'd been an art teacher. Small public high school on the west side. Didn't pay much, but he'd loved it. The smell of chalk dust, the thrill when a student accidentally made something beautiful and didn't even realize it yet. And then came the accident. His son Milo, 9 years old, bike, intersection, drunk driver, an instant, a ripple. He never returned to the classroom after that. Couldn't bear the smell of tempera paint anymore. Couldn't bear the sound of kids laughing without a trace of him in it. So he took the job at the museum. At first, it was just a way to be near art again, without having to create anything. He told himself it was enough. until one night he found himself sketching shadows on the marble floors, then outlines of frames, then gestures he never meant for anyone to see. The next day, the board's assistant reached out. "Someone on the panel has requested to see your sketchbook," the email said. Harold hesitated before replying. He didn't know what scared him more, the rejection or the validation. He replied with a short line, "They can view it in person. I won't send scans." Later that night, Lewis came by again. He brought Harold a container of chicken stew and sat with him on the stoop. "They're still talking about it at the museum," he said. Harold stared out at the neighbor's porch, light flickering. "I'm not going back, Louis." Louis gave a dry chuckle. "Don't be so sure." A beat passed. "I saw one of your sketches once," Louis added more softly now. "One with that kid, standing under the skylight." Harold stiffened. "That wasn't supposed to be seen." "It was beautiful," Louis said. "Sad." But not in a hopeless way. Silence wrapped around them for a while. Then Harold muttered almost to himself, "What if they put my drawings behind glass like the others?" Lewis sipped his thermos coffee. Maybe it's time the walls looked back. The next morning, Harold walked into the museum. He was let in by a quiet intern who led him to the empty conference hall. A panel of 5 people sat at a long table, Claire included, and beside her, the visiting curator. She didn't look smug now, just tense, guarded. A screen had been set up beside the table. Claire cleared her throat. "Mr. Watts, we've reviewed your sketchbook." Several members of the board were deeply moved. The screen flickered on. Image after image began cycling Harold's drawings. A child asleep on a gallery bench. A woman wiping fog from a glass case. A night guard reflected faintly in the polished surface of a sculpture. "They aren't copies," said the board chair softly. "They're conversations." Harold sat still, silent. "These were never intended for the public?" Claire asked. "No," Harold replied. The curator spoke next, her voice less cold now. "I owe you an apology. I assumed theft when I saw skill." Harold met her eyes. "You're not the first." The room went quiet. Claire turned to the board. "We have a proposal. A special temporary exhibition, 1 month only. A single room. No press releases. No fanfare. Just a chance to let people see what he saw." And then the board voted. Unanimous. Harold would be rehired, and his sketches would hang on the walls. They called it the eyes that watch the walls. 2 weeks later, the museum's East Wing underwent a quiet transformation. The old photography archive room, usually locked and dust-lined, was cleaned, painted, and fitted with soft gallery lighting. On its freshly whitewashed walls, frames went up simple black borders, no gold plating, no ornate labels. Just his sketches exactly as they were. Charcoal on cream paper, pencil on recycled cardstock, some wrinkled from years in his bag, none touched up. At the entrance, a title card that read, "The Eyes That Watch the Walls Observational Sketches by Harold Watts." No degrees listed, no biography, just his name. When he stepped in for the private preview, the room was empty save for Louis and Claire. They dimmed the lights slightly, let soft instrumental music play from a speaker in the corner. "I didn't know how to arrange them," Claire said softly, "so I went with chronological. It felt like watching a quiet diary unfold." Harold looked around. There was the piece of the Rothko, not the painting, but the janitor mopping in front of it, back bent the color bleeding into his reflection. There was the hand again, his late wife's. He remembered tracing it from memory after a particularly rough week. And in the far corner, Milo, still a silhouette, still under that skylight. He hadn't drawn the boy's face, not because he couldn't, but because he was afraid if he did, it might make him forget the real one. Opening day was supposed to be soft. No ads, no posts, just word of mouth. Still by noon, the line wrapped halfway down the central corridor. Many came curious, a few skeptical, but most left hushed. A woman exited in tears and paused by the fountain out front. A father carried a child asleep on his shoulder. Teenagers stopped snapping selfies for once and simply stood arms crossed, staring up at the charcoal sketch of a homeless man resting beneath the Degas exhibit someone Harold used to greet every Tuesday morning with a bagel. Some asked to buy prints. The museum declined. At home that night, Harold sat at his kitchen table, the news clipping still trembling in his fingers. They'd run a piece in the city paper. the hidden artist behind the security desk. No scandal, no scandalous revelation. Just a slow unfolding of a man's quiet world. He wasn't sure how to feel. He'd spent so long trying not to be seen. Now he was framed and hung and named. "You proud, Lewis?" had asked that morning, as they stood outside the building. Harold had paused, thought long, then answered, "I don't know yet." But something had shifted. The weight in his chest didn't feel so sharp anymore. The following weekend, someone knocked on his apartment door. A boy, maybe 17, stood awkwardly on the porch, holding a small sketch pad. "Mr. Watts?" he asked. Harold stepped out. "Yes, I saw the show. Twice. And, The boy hesitated. "I don't think I'm any good, but I keep drawing in math class, and my mom says it's a waste of time. I guess I just wondered if I could show you something." Harold nodded slowly. "You can." They sat on the porch bench, flipping through pages. Lines jagged but full of movement. Messy, but not aimless. "You draw the spaces between things," Harold said, impressed. "That's rare." The boy looked stunned. "Keep doing it," Harold added. "No matter who says not to." That week, Harold was invited to speak at a local college. The dean introduced him with a few humble notes, and the lights dimmed. Harold stepped up to the podium, cleared his throat, and didn't read from the notes they gave him. He looked out at the art students. "You spend enough years behind a barrier," he began, "and you start to forget your own voice." He paused. "I didn't go to art school. I didn't train in Italy. I don't know what a medium means in half the ways you do, but I watched. I listened." He looked down at his hands. "I drew because I needed to, because memory was slipping, because I was afraid I'd forget the shape of grief. If I didn't make it still." A student in the front row wiped her eye. Another raised a hand. "How do you know if it's worth showing?" she asked. Harold smiled gently. "If it haunted you long enough to draw it, someone else is probably haunted too." Later that evening, Claire called. "We've had requests from 3 other galleries," she said, voice unusually warm. "Even an international one in Amsterdam." Harold chuckled. "What'll you do?" she asked. He looked out the window where dusk bled gold into the sky. "Maybe nothing," he replied. "Maybe just keep watching." Claire was silent for a moment, then said, "You know, the piece with the janitor, that one stayed with me. I realized I've walked past that man every morning and never learned his name." Harold didn't speak. Sometimes silence was the best kind of acknowledgement. A month later, on the last day of the exhibit, Harold returned to the room one final time. The lighting was soft, the benches empty, except for one figure near the corner, his former boss, the man who had once avoided him after the scandal. He was staring at the sketch of a man slumped over a security monitor, Harold's old self. The man turned as Harold entered, met his eyes. "You caught more than art in these," he said quietly. Harold just nodded. Before he left, he took one last look at the entrance plaque. His name, nothing more. And for once, it was enough. The room was quiet again, but this time it didn't feel lonely. Harold stood in the exhibit's doorway for a while longer, hands in his coat pockets, listening to the faint hum of the climate system above. The final visitors were still trickling out behind him, some whispering, some silent, all leaving slower than they'd arrived. Harold came a familiar voice behind him. It was Samira, the overnight guard, who'd taken over most of Harold's old shifts since the exhibit opened. She smiled gently. "We're all proud of you, you know." He gave her a half smile. "Feels strange, doesn't it?" She chuckled. "Strange, yeah. But not wrong." Outside, the wind had picked up. Trees in the plaza swayed, dropping brittle brown leaves across the museum steps. Harold pulled his scarf tighter and started walking home. He still took the long route, same one he'd walked for years, past the cafe, where he used to grab day-old pastries after work, past the bookstore that kept a little tin for staff recommendations. He paused there. In the front window, under the display labeled Staff Pics, someone had propped up a printout of the city paper article about his exhibit. Underneath, a handwritten note read, "Sometimes the quietest voices leave the deepest marks." He stared at it for a long time. The days blurred into winter. The museum closed the exhibit mid-January, just as scheduled. Some of the sketches were moved into the permanent collection. Others were returned to Harold's care, his choice. Claire insisted they should be archived. He'd agreed, but only the ones that meant something to others. The rest he kept, in a drawer, folded, creased, some smudged by thumbprints and time, but never forgotten. Then one afternoon in February, Claire called again. "There's someone I think you should meet," she said. She wouldn't explain more. Just asked him to come to the museum early the next morning. So he did. The halls were dim, not yet filled with patrons. Claire met him at the west entrance, coat buttoned high, a nervous energy about her. They walked in silence to the main lobby, where a young man waited on one of the benches. He wore a knit hat, pulled low, dark curls peeking from underneath. He looked up, and Harold's breath caught. It was Milo, older, sharper around the eyes, a faint scar along his cheekbone that hadn't been there before. But it was him. Milo stood awkwardly, hands buried in his coat pockets. "I asked Claire to contact you," he said. "I wasn't sure you'd say yes." Harold blinked, emotions crashing into one another. "I didn't know where you'd gone," he finally said. "I had to leave," Milo murmured. "That night, the city came for my aunt. Ice. She was all I had. I didn't want them to find me, too." Harold nodded slowly. Milo went on. "I bounced around, shelter to shelter, drew when I could. I saw the article about you. I thought, maybe you'd still remember me." "I do," Harold said quietly. "I never stopped." Milo swallowed. "I've been clean for almost a year now." Harold's throat tightened. "I'm proud of you." Milo looked down, his voice barely audible. "Can I show you something?" He pulled a sketchbook from his backpack. The lines were wild, confident, but raw. People in motion buildings cracked open with light. One drawing near the middle was of an older man sitting at a desk, eyes sharp, shoulders slumped. It was Harold. "You used to watch the walls," Milo said, "so I started drawing the people who leaned on them." Harold laughed unexpectedly, and then cried. Just a little. From that day on, Milo visited once a week, sometimes to sketch beside Harold, sometimes just to sit and talk. The museum let them use a corner room for quiet work Claire's doing. It wasn't public, not yet, but it was enough. That spring, Harold was invited to sit on the museum's new community board, a panel formed to include local artists, volunteers, and workers who had never had a voice before. It was Claire's idea again. At the first meeting, a gallery investor raised an eyebrow at Harold's presence. "I thought this panel was for professionals," he muttered. Claire responded before Harold could. "He's more professional than anyone I've met in this building," she said calmly. "He just never needed a spotlight to prove it." One evening, weeks later, Harold walked home through the rain. The streets shimmered. Reflections of traffic lights danced in the puddles. At his apartment door, something was waiting. A package, brown paper, no return address. Inside a sketch, done in ink. It was of him and Milo seated beside each other in that quiet museum room, sketchbook's open heads slightly bowed. Underneath, written in neat print, "Because you saw me when no one else did." Harold touched the paper gently, and for a moment the world felt still. Not silent, not empty, just still. The sun was already low when Harold returned to the museum that weekend. Golden light filtered in through the tall windows, painting slow-moving shapes across the marble floor. He wasn't there for work. Not anymore. He was there for something new. At the far end of the gallery, under a freshly painted arch that read, "The Eyes That Watched the Walls, a Legacy Room," a small crowd had started to gather. Claire stood near the entrance, clipboard in hand, smiling warmly as she greeted guests. Nearby, Samira helped an elderly woman up the steps, while Milo set out pencils on a long table by the window, an open invitation for visitors to sketch their impressions, just like Harold once did during his quiet shifts. The exhibit wasn't just Harold's anymore. It was a living space now, a growing thing. Part gallery, part community corner, part tribute. Inside, on the largest wall, hung a collection of Harold's original night sketches, each framed in thin black wood, spaced just so. There was one of the janitor asleep beside a mop bucket, one of a mother holding her crying child during a stormy visit, one of the museum director checking her reflection in a silver sculpture. And in the center, boldest, most detailed, was a sketch of the main exhibit room from the guard's point of view. Slightly askew, slightly distant. At the very bottom, in Harold's own scrawled handwriting, "I was here. I was watching." A group of school kids passed by, giggling, notebooks flapping. One pointed at the wall. "Wait, he really worked here." Claire nodded. "More than that. He saw what we missed." A boy whispered to his friend Bet he was like a museum ninja. Harold chuckled softly from a corner seat, unnoticed. He didn't mind. Later, he sat beside Milo on one of the cushioned benches facing the exhibit. "Feels different," Milo said. "How so?" Harold asked. Milo looked around. Before it was all glass and rules. Now it's like, I don't know, like people actually breathe in here. Harold nodded slowly. "Yeah, I think I know what you mean." Milo turned to him. "You ever think you'd end up like this?" Harold smiled. "Not once." There was a pause. Then Harold added, "But maybe that's the point." In the months that followed, the legacy room became a quiet phenomenon. Not a viral one, not loud, but steady. Every week someone new would leave a sketch behind, sometimes rough, sometimes beautiful. They were hung with clothespins on a wire wall near the back. Anonymous, imperfect. Visitors started calling it the wall that watches back. Some were drawings of the museum. Others were self-portraits. One was just a shaky crayon scribble of a man holding a flashlight labeled Mr. Guard. It had no signature. Harold saved that one for last every night before locking up. Then came the day the museum asked Harold to speak at the annual donors' brunch. He nearly said no. Public speaking wasn't his thing. But Milo convinced him. So standing behind a narrow podium in a sunlit courtyard, Harold took a deep breath and began. "I spent most of my life in quiet rooms," he said. The crowd leaned in. "I watch people look at art. I watch them admire beauty, argue over meaning past judgment. But they didn't know they were being watched too, not in a creepy way, just noticed." He paused, steadying his voice. "For years I drew the moments no one thought mattered, the spaces in between." He looked over at Claire, who smiled through glassy eyes. "I used to think maybe those moments weren't worth anything," Harold continued. But I was wrong. He held up a folded piece of paper, the drawing Milo had left on his doorstep. "Someone once told me, because I saw them, they kept going. And now I see you. All of you. Thank you for seeing me back." There was silence, then a slow rising wave of applause. Later that evening, when the courtyard was empty, Harold wandered back into the legacy room alone. The sun had dipped behind the buildings, casting long shadows across the floor. He stood in front of the central sketch, the angled one, the view from the watchman's post, and he saw it differently now. Not distant, not removed, but essential. From that vantage point, everything made sense. The gaps, the silences, the things no one spoke of, because someone had been there all along, just watching. That night, as he left through the employee exit one last time, Samira called after him. "You're off the schedule starting next week, right?" "Yeah," he said, smiling. "Time to try new hours." She laughed. "Museum ninja." "Retiring." He shook his head. "Not retiring," Harold replied. "Just sketching from the other side now." Have you ever felt invisible in a place you gave your heart to? Sometimes the quietest contributions leave the longest echoes, and the people no one sees often see the most. If you've ever felt overlooked or quietly held a gift the world didn't notice, I'd love to hear your story in the comments. Let's make space for voices, like Harold's voices, that watched the walls while the world passed by. If this story moved, you consider subscribing, liking, and turning on notifications. Thanks for staying till the end. We'll see you in the next one.